at a time last class talking about photo composition. I'm going to just briefly go over the things that we talked in class, and then we're going to continue and learn a little bit more compositional tools and look at 2 documentary stories that apply a lot of those ideas, okay, that are kind of interesting stories. So really the first thing we talked about is that making sure your image is in focus, that's the quickest way to ruin an image, right? You just have to make sure your picture is in focus and the part of the picture that you want in focus is in focus. So that's tricky with your cameras. When you hold the shutter halfway, it's going to engage the autofocus. If you have to make sure that on your lens, it's switched to AF, autofocus. Once that's good, you hold it down and it'll focus on whatever you want to focus on, and then you can take the picture. But just be cautious because sometimes it focuses what's behind your subject, called back focusing. So you want to make sure that your image is properly focused. We also want to make sure that we show people. Stories are so much more powerful when we can see the people that are impacted by them. Even if it's a new building, right? You're writing a story about a new building, or I had to do an assignment on a new carpet in the student center, right? When I was in college, the assignment, you could take a picture of the carpet, but really you want to see people engaging with that space or that carpet, right? We talked about evaluating where light comes from. In this image by Claire Reverie, the light is coming from behind the photographer and it's illuminating the subject. So assess the situation and think about where the light is coming from so that you can use that light to your advantage rather than fighting against it. It looks cool sometimes to fight against it, but it's a little bit harder of a technique. So use the light in your advantage. Stand on the side where when you point your camera at people, the beautiful light is on them, right? So using window light in this way can be really amazing. We talked about filling the frame, right? So this picture on the right, there is nothing distracting in the image, but in this image on the left, we have a building, we have a trash can, we have this tree. The person we're making a portrait of is a little bit lost in the composition. Instead, get close and think about your whole picture and make sure that all of it is being used wisely. We spoke about rule of thirds, this grid, and how our eyes are naturally drawn to these intersections. So if you can, try to push yourself to put action or reaction or person on these intersections. And it will create the sense of balance that is very attainable out in the field. It's really difficult to put something perfectly in the middle. And instead, aiming for rule of thirds and thinking in terms of this grid and aiming for the intersections can create a lot of very beautiful balance, right? The eyes are pretty much right on that grid. Same here with this picture. Let me move myself. She really exists on that plane, right? Okay, so rule of thirds is helpful. Then we talked about symmetry, which is more if you were to fold an image in half, it's very even. So this is created a lot of times by the environment, right? The environment of these stairs, or maybe these bicycles or these like chalkboards behind them. But symmetry is often used when you think about the environment. It creates this kind of uncanny sense of similarity on either side. And a lot of times it's environmental that makes something feel symmetrical. And even though these are precise, a lot of times you'll see something like this where the balance is actually pretty imprecise, right? These are not the exact same person, but they're doing the same thing on a similar, they're doing the same thing and it's split down the middle. And also that is also mirrored on the bottom in the reflection. So there's a lot of symmetry here, both if you were to fold the picture this way and this way. We talked about how sometimes symmetry is less perfectly the same, but more that either side of the image holds a really significant weight, right? So these are professional musicians practicing for cows during the pandemic, but the cows are all in a line and it mimics the line of the musicians. And so if you were to fold it, those two lines would overlap. So this isn't the most traditional kind of symmetry, but that's what I think in terms of symmetry, that the weight is the same on either end of your picture. And it's intended to feel like if you fold it, it would overlap. Okay, we talked about this idea of completing shapes. Our eyes are most naturally drawn to the brightest part of an image, this man's glasses, right? It would be different if he overlapped with the bed frame. Try to move your body to find that bright, illuminated space and use that, the brightest part of the image, to help us look at the thing you want us to look at. Right? So don't lose your people in their backgrounds. If you're going to take a picture and there's a tree in the background, right? Just move slightly so that that tree isn't right behind them, so that you're not growing branches out of their head, right? So that bow isn't lost in the trees. But rather, if you move so that you can kind of clean up the background behind them, it can make for some really incredibly powerful images where it's a very quick read and that shape pops out from the background and you're able to see that complete shape. I love this picture of the lobster, right? Pops straight out from the water. We often see pictures like this on Instagram. I love this photographer. The reason it pops out is there's so much contrast between the subject and the background. But that idea of completing shapes, don't lose your subject in the background. If these hikers had waited and they were lost maybe here or maybe there, you wouldn't be able to see them quite as clearly. So kind of waiting for someone to walk into a space that has a cleaner background, or moving yourself to get a different vantage point, maybe shooting up so that you can look up at the sky and clean up that background to allow someone to pop out and have that contrast that pops out from their image. I am gonna, sorry, one second. Going to extend this actually so you can see it even more. Pop out from the image underneath them, right? Okay, we talked about framing, which is stepping back and using the elements in the scene to help draw your viewer in. So I like to think it's looking through something. Framing usually creates the sense of layers. So even though this is a cool image, right? We look through the door frame and we're able to see a lot more of that. Sometimes you can put your picture, this picture is naturally framed in the window, right? Or you can actively look through things. So the skier, we're looking through another skier's legs at the skier behind them. He's framed in this other skier, right? This face is framed in these signs. We look at the subject, she's framed through the vehicle that shows the damage of this fire, of this wildfire, right? And we're able to, through what we decide to frame someone in, use so much of that context to give information to your viewers. It's really powerful to be able to see that. While this is a picture of these boats, it's framed really through these women. It creates this sense of foreground and background. So I think framing and layers goes right together. This idea of looking through something, looking past something to something else. So sometimes we see that in a reflection, right? There's obviously a mirror behind this dancer, and we're able to see the dancer and then their reflection in the back. Same with this picture of Beyonce. And this beautiful image of a couple who is separated for their own protection because of COVID. We're able to see the subject on the very left-hand side, the reflection in the middle, and then her reaction to it. This sense of layers really pulls you in. So I think framing is a way to create layers, but those are two slightly separate ideas to really push yourself to think of. Okay, so now we're caught up for those of you who missed class, but now as we move forward, other ideas that I want to push you to think about. Get close. So Robert Capa is one of the fathers of photojournalism, and he says, if your pictures aren't good enough, you're not close enough. And I think this is true. We naturally, when we first start taking pictures, we like to just keep our safe distance away from people. We don't want to interrupt them or bother them. But when you get close, and this is an image where it was taken with a zoom lens, which allowed them to zoom in and get very, very close. But a lot of times, if you just stand closer to people, you're able to get some really incredible images and focus on what are called details, these close-ups. So this picture, right? The reason this is a storytelling image is because we can see the sweat dripping down Beto O'Rourke's face. And that tells us so much about the feeling of what it was like when he was giving that speech, right? Here's another image from Wildfires. This detail of the tear, we're so close, right? This detail of Aria Cipollone crying near the remains of her family home pulls us in. It feels so intimate, right? Similar, this tear when an Olympic gold medalist was about to be awarded their medal, right? When you pull in those details, really pull things out from you. And here's another detail that is one that makes me laugh. This is by a good friend, Jabin Botsford. Just this unbelievable detail, right? This was shot obviously with a zoom lens, but looking for these wild details. Maybe they're really storytelling. Maybe someone is wearing a pin, right, for an organization that means a lot to them, or a joke that they love, or a part of their identity, right? Maybe people have a detail like a tattoo that they recently got that means a lot to them. It's a very storytelling image. Maybe it's a patch on their backpack or a sticker on their water bottle, right? There's a lot of different details that you can look for that can actually be incredibly storytelling about a person. So I would encourage you to look for details. And details are really fun. And I do want you to look for details that still have to do with a person, right? So like still we're pushing these to look for people. But they can be wearing them, right? Or maybe you see their hands and you see like the details of their notes. All right. The next idea that I want to introduce you to is called patterns. So patterns are just aesthetically pleasing, and they're even better when they're disrupted. Okay. So we have all of these yellow cars, right? And it's just this unbelievably graphic image. It looks almost like it's just startling to see because it's so different than the way that we view the world, right? But these patterns make for such interesting, colorful pictures. Okay, so these are these cars. This is a recent picture from February 2021. This is a runner in Stockholm. So the color tone of this image, these whites and blacks, is interrupted by this red runner, right? So it's incredibly graphic. We have either side of the image is very graphic in its own unique way. And then we have a red runner who runs by, right? So it's all of a sudden interrupted. But this idea of patterns, just looking at kind of a different way of seeing the world where it feels more graphic than it normally would. So this is a woman walks under snowfall in front of a Soyuz rocket installed as a monument near the Russian leased Kazakh Baikonur Cosmodrome on December 5th, 2021. So what makes this image so graphic, I think, is the snow, right? It is actually the rocket, and then it's the snow. There's so much texture to this image, right? Here are solar panels. It's just this concept of these repeating shapes. A lot of times you'll see this kind of graphic pattern in a city, right? So this is just a city, but it just feels repetitive. The buildings, the lights, the colors, right? So looking for that kind of new way of seeing the world that really makes us zoom in and think and look at pattern for pattern. And then, like I said, pattern is so fun, especially when it's interrupted. So I love this image of, there's symmetry, right? We have the two sections of this building that kind of pop out. Then we have the consistency of all the windows, but one of them has a person smoking out of it, right? It's interrupted. It surprises us. It pops out. So a lot of times pattern, the easiest way to find pattern is to change your angle, right? To look down at the world or look up at the world, or look for details like all the bicycle tires, get really close to that repeating shape. So sometimes looking for something like shadows can create a really graphic pattern. Looking out a window, looking down at those cars, right? I like this. This is on a bus in Mumbai, right? Or train. But I guess it's a train, but just all of the repeating shapes of the hands, right? So think about that. Is there some kind of space where it's the patterns that really pull you in? Another thing to think about is that the angle at which you stand when you take a picture impacts how you feel about your subject. Okay. So whether you're looking up at someone or looking down at someone can make you really respect and revere someone, and they can feel really powerful. Like this is called a power shot, right? We're looking up at him and it makes that person feel incredibly powerful, right? But if we end up looking down at someone, it can almost feel like the opposite side of the spectrum where we don't respect them quite as much and we're looking down at them, right? So instead of just pointing your camera down at children, one of the things that you can do is you can get on a child's level. I need to plug my computer in. You can get on the child level, which can actually make you see the world in a slightly different way. And it can really elevate your subject. So here is another example, right? I bet the photographer was taller than this child, but by adjusting their angle, it allows us to kind of feel the subject in a really different way because the angle was shifted. So sometimes the angle that you take to a subject can make you feel a certain way about your subject, but also can just make you see the world in a much more interesting way. So here is a gymnastics, right? A gymnastics shot. Like, how do I get my face out of the way? This is not a way that we see the world. So seeing an image like this is so interesting because it's just so different than the way that we naturally see the world. Similar to this, right? This like awesome shoe shot, right? It's different. It's just not the way that we see the world. And so it's fun to play with angles and to allow us to see the world from a perspective that we don't normally see it. All right. Action is always really fun, capturing action. This is, I think, why we love sports photography so much, because it captures this moment, right? This fraction of a second where everything falls into place. Henri Cartier-Bresson called it the decisive moment. But thinking about capturing motion and having motion be a very pivotal element to your image. Kind of similar to this. There's so much joy and movement in the image, right? They probably weren't just standing there. This is kind of catching a moment, which I think is really beautiful. All right. Another idea, if you want to be a photographer for magazines, is this idea of capturing negative space. So negative space is still this concept of filling the frame, but instead of getting really, really close, negative space actually kind of steps back and allows there to be all of this extra space, but that space isn't distracting. It's almost like dead space. It's not used for anything. But the reason it's so valuable in a photography context is that if I were to publish this image of President Trump by J.M. Botsford, if I were to publish this image, I would have all of this space to write text to make a really interesting visual for the magazine, right? So it allows us all this space to add other graphic elements with overlay and design later on in a publication. So negative space, I think, can also be really interesting. And this picture, the negative space, was actually created by framing the president or the former president, through other journalists. So instead of getting a clear shot, Jabin Botsford allowed other photographers' bodies to get really close to the frame. And so they were out of focus because his focus was behind them. But you look through them at Trump. In a similar way, there's a lot of negative space up here with the cloud and the sand, but it's intentional. It feels balanced. So you don't always have to be detailed close to it, right? But you don't want to have images in your frame that are distracting, right? So sometimes negative space can be very, very helpful. All right. A few other tips and tricks to just think about. One, move closer. This isn't just zoom your camera in, actually get closer. And what you will find is that the closer that you get, and when you ask people like, hey, can I take a picture of you? I'm taking a picture for a photojournalism class or for my journalism class. Once people allow you into their space, you build a rapport with them, and then you just get more comfortable, more interesting pictures. So even though it seems like you'll feel more comfortable if you're further away, instead just ask people if you can take a picture of them and then get close, right? So Robert Capa's idea of if your pictures aren't good enough, you're not close enough, I think that's true. I think you just need to get closer than you think you need to get to your images. Another idea is to shoot the full scene. This means instead of just taking one image of a moment, push yourself to take different kinds of images of the same moment. So if you see someone walking to class or playing frisbee or laughing on the quad, whatever it is, instead of taking one image, try to take an image that's wide, meaning far away, that maybe has a lot of negative space, that's zoomed out, where you see them. Maybe you stand in a place so that they can pop out from their background and you get a completed shape and a lot of negative space, right? Then get a medium shot, zoom in and get even tighter. So, this might be my wide shot, right? My medium shot might be right here where you're much closer in. And then a tight shot might be like my eyeball, right? Or maybe it'll be like a detail on my card. You'll get like a hand and a ring, right? Or whatever it is. So think in terms of kind of start back and then get closer and closer. And that idea of shooting wide and then medium and then really detailed and tighter will give you so much visual variety. You'll get a lot of really interesting pictures that way. And the test that I give myself around visual variety is if I look at all my pictures and people's heads are the same size, I did not scoot far back and get close. I only allowed myself to, usually it means you're shooting the similar distance away from people if their heads are the same size, right? But if you get close, you'll have a really big head, right? You'll have a detail that's really close, right? And then maybe you'll have a really tiny head because you're really far back. So look through your images and just kind of check yourself to see if people's heads are different sizes in your images. And then I would encourage you to not always shoot at eye level. So we talked about this with your perspectives, but just play around with getting close to the ground, or Hail Mary it, lift your camera way up above your head and see what happens if you take a picture like that, right? Just play around with different angles, maybe stand up on something cautiously, have someone spot you, but play around with different angles, because I think that will help you a lot in terms of just getting different perspectives of the world and making interesting compositions, right? So have fun with this assignment. And I'm going to show you a few more examples, but I'm going to do that in another video just so that you can have a break.